Thank you. Thank you, President Jones, for the invitation to be with you today and for a few more days after that. I am tremendously grateful to the students of Union Theological Seminary, to each member of the search committee, to the faculty, to the Board of Trustees, and to Dean Mary Boyes, who talked about the proximity of Union to New Jersey, where the Sopranos reside, and who stood ready to use certain persuasive measures should I have any doubts. Well, I am undoubtedly astounded, really astounded, and honored to be here among you, many of whom, whether you know it or not, have been my teachers. My teachers have included not only the faculty at Yale and Chicago where I trained, but also, of course, James Cone and Gary Dorian and Serene Jones and Daisy Machado and Cornel West. And also, of course, Dietrich Bonhoeffer, Katie Cannon, Jacqueline Grant, Christopher Morse, Reinhold Niebuhr, Walter Rauschenbusch, Paul Tillich, Phyllis Tribble, Emily Towns, Walter Rauschenbusch again, Dolores Williams. And this is not to mention Union alum, Allison Bowden, Liz Bounds, Dwight Hopkins, Ian McFarland, Diane Stewart, and countless, countless, countless others. I extend thanks to all of you. And by the way, Mom and Dad, those are all very famous people from Union. I extend to all of you present today and to those founders in 1836 who were deeply impressed by the claims of the world upon the church. Thankfully, almost 180 years later, theologians are still grappling with the claims of the world on the church. It is now seen as a fundamental task of the entire theological enterprise. In her 2010 Christian Century article, Catherine Tanner writes, "Theologians are now primarily called to provide not a theoretical argument for Christianity's plausibility, but an account of how Christianity can be part of the solution, rather than part of the problem, on matters that make a life and death difference to people, especially the poor and the oppressed." Theology is now concerned with how belief can undergird the course of social action. Even theological methods should not be just talk, as she puts it, but aims for cultural meaning. In short, theology matters. And Tanner is not interested in simply baptizing questions of cultural anthropology or cloaking the questions of critical theory or social action in religious garb. The critical point is theology's capacity to propose the unexpected, to shock and to startle. Theology's imaginative expansiveness sees beyond elite forms of theological expression to the popular theologies of everyday life, to tell us something we don't already know. What Rosemary Radford Ruther said 40 years ago is still true today. One of the urgent tasks of theology has become the critique of ideology within theology itself. Ideology, she says, means the way established worldviews reflect and legitimate social domination, making other options unimaginable. The worldview of the ruling group defines the boundaries of reality and the nature of God. Theologically, this critique of ideology is the critique of idolatry. It is a recognition of the way in which our dominant theological constructs have themselves been servants and sanctions of evil, giving legitimacy and invisibility to our racism, sexism, class power, and colonialism. The oneness of God is projected onto the dominant group, thereby making the dominant sex, race, class, nation, and religion the one true humanity in relation to which all others become unmentionable and subhuman. The melting pot has one mold into which all others must disappear by way of assimilation, genocide, or subjugation. What then is our eschatological vision? What is the task of womanist theology? Is our mission to get us beyond race and gender? Is Judith Butler's theory of gender performance a feminist eschaton? Is the womanist agenda reached only at the end of human history? In The Erotic Life of Racism, Shannon Patricia Holland argues that for all our work to do away with binary thinking, there's actually some work that the binary does for critical theory. Without exposing all the work of racial and gender binaries, we're guilty of perpetuating the violent myth of the post-racial. Even beginning students in race studies have learned that colorblindness is not a progressive stance on racialized identity that transcends the visibility of race. It manifests a white anxiety about seeing race. It is the fear of acknowledging that one sees race. It is the refusal or denial that one sees social injustice on the basis of race. You don't have to acknowledge what you don't see. Linda Martine Alcoff says colorblindness is regularly claimed by white folks and regularly repudiated by folks of color. It means that racism is not a lived reality for the one who declares herself to be colorblind. But we know, at least I know you know at Union, that race is not just a black issue, that all human beings are racialized. And that means that not only blackness, but even whiteness is a social construction. And the presupposition that we're all the same under the skin and the failure to live into this sameness is considered a moral failing, the fault of people of color. The point is that if you are black and can't fit into the norm established by whiteness, then it is your fault. From this perspective, identity in persons of color is based on what a person is not. Blackness is non-whiteness. Blackness or color is a deviance from the norm that is white. The social construction of colored identity then becomes critical for maintaining the concept of white identity. But as Emily Towns argues, whiteness is not a static, objective, or fixed category with no history. Whiteness is not a neutral category. So when we speak of colorblindness, it is usually to ignore the messiness of race, the complexity of race. It assumes that differences are divisive, bad. Difference is a challenge, but that does not entail that difference in itself is sinful. And colorblindness implies a non-colored self who is actually white in disguise. So this whole concept of whiteness means individuals, whether they actively participate in racist behavior or consciously have a racist mindset or not, benefit from the social construction of whiteness. There is no such thing as racial purity. Ferguson and Staten Island have served as acute reminders that the myth of post-racial discourse, the neoliberal myth of universalism that says we're all the same under the skin, and why can't we just all get along? This myth is not only not a viable alternative, it is the furthest thing from everyday lived experience. Theologians have a lot of work to do. Indeed, we need a word from above that tells us something we don't already know. As for the task of womanist theology, it is well positioned to expose the normalization of violence. Cheryl Kirk-Dugan minces no words when she describes the god of violence. Violence titillates and terrorizes us, packaged in celluloid and running for 120 minutes, sagas of blood, guts, and gore with fast action, terrific cinematography, a provocative and sultry music score, and actors exhibiting high-profile careers are the things that make for an Oscar. That same ethos packaged in a 40-ounce bottle, a 100-proof flask, or a container of nose candy, thrust on our neighbors or the folks down the block, next door, across the street, or in exclusive condominiums, reeks of dehumanization. Such deviant conduct results in domestic abuse, violence, addiction, even murder, making violence a #1 public health menace. Cheryl Kirk-Dugan says violence is a public health crisis. An adrenaline rush compels people to kill spirits, minds, and, of course, bodies. Such violence is personal and individual. It's also communal and systemic. And our globalization means we are no longer innocent bystanders. Our postmodern culture celebrates wars, marvels at ethnic cleansings, seeks human sacrifices, and gawks at ritualized murders and interracial violence. Cheryl Kirk-Dugan goes on to say, our nationhood is rooted in violence. This union developed on lands taken from native peoples, moistened by their trail of tears. Much of the labor in this country, constructing buildings and railroads, producing goods in factories, and through farming, has been accomplished through subjugation and slavery. We have canonized and ritualized this violence in our national anthem with bombs bursting in air. Dolores Williams is famous for saying, "There is no power in the blood." Of course, she was talking about the Christian theological presumption that the shedding of blood is requisite for salvation, that suffering is in itself redemptive, that Black women's surrogacy, whether coerced or uncoerced, is divinely sanctioned. Dolores Williams' student, Joanne Marie Terrell, kept the phrase in play when she titled her book, "Power in the Blood," ending with a question mark. She agreed with her teacher, Dolores Williams, that suffering is not redemptive, but neither is it utterly meaningless. In his autobiography, Howard Thurman makes an interesting link between more quotidian forms of state-sanctioned violence as a statement of the worth of his 2 young daughters. Maybe you've heard this story. On one of our visits to Daytona Beach, I was eager to show my daughters some of my early haunts. At length, we passed the playground of one of the white public schools. As soon as Olive and Ann saw the swings, they jumped for joy. "Look, Daddy, let's go over and swing." This was the inescapable moment of truth that every Black parent in America must face soon or late. What do you say to your child at the critical moment of primary encounter? You can't swing on those swings. Why? When we get home and have some lemonade, I will tell you. When we were home again and had our lemonade, Anne pressed for the answer. "We're home now, Daddy, tell us." I said, "It is against the law for us to use those swings, even though it is a public school. At present, only white children can play there, but it takes the state legislature, the courts, the sheriffs, and the policemen, the white churches, the mayors, the banks and businesses, and the majority of white people in the state of Florida. It takes all these to keep 2 little Black girls from swinging on those swings. That is how important you are." Never forget the estimate of your own importance and self-worth can be judged by how many weapons and how much power people are willing to use to control you and keep you in your place, the place they have assigned to you. You are 2 very important little girls. Your presence can threaten the entire state of Florida. This is a revelation. This is a revelation, and revelation, I contend, is the most critical starting point for womanist theology for 2 essential reasons. First, the reality of multiple oppressions intersecting on Black women's bodies is born of and lives by covert ideological discourse. Human oppression is, of course, quite often unabashedly overt. Examples both extant and throughout history abound. But the insidious effect of covert oppression requires the unveiling of its modes of concealment. And the second reason is a corollary to the first. A womanist hermeneutic of revelation must ground the theological project because the reality that God has been revealed to and through Black women is itself contested and therefore warrants revelation. Covert ideologies have quite successfully hidden this fact from view. For these reasons, we may say the raison d'etre of womanist theology is the call to reveal, to render this fact of covert ideology a revealed reality, and to discover what divine revelation has to say about it. So a double revelation is at stake for womanist theology, to reveal oppression and to reveal God, with an aim to address the point of intersection between the two, namely Black women's experience and divine response. Racism and sexism are quotidian. To foreground the everyday experience of Black women's lives is to foreground the quotidian everyday nature of these intersecting forms of oppression. As Bell Hooks contends, there is an assumption that the United States does not have a public policy of discrimination, a government-sanctioned politics of race, yet imperialist, white supremacist, capitalist patriarchy, as she puts it, is internalized by almost everyone and shapes everything from our culture to our politics. This undercover reality functions as the underlying belief system informing nearly every aspect of this nation's culture and habits of daily life. When it comes to race, we are still prone to believe that race is a Black issue and that internalized racism is a psychological condition, not a political problem or collective trauma. Bell Hooks makes what I think is a useful distinction between racism and white supremacy, pointing out that while most people in the United States would resist overt racist practice, white supremacy describes the underlying cultural ethos and unwitting collusion with systemic forces that perpetuate racism. The distinction rests on the difference between overt and covert expressions of oppression. The problem is exacerbated by mistakenly identifying the economic uplift of a small sample set as an indicator of freedom, pointing to the possibility of economic power as sufficient in itself to overcome the entire system of discrimination. The traumatic experience of facing racist assault on a daily basis and documented by numerous studies of African American health is evidence to the contrary. The reality of oppression in Black women's experience, much too real for those who experience it, is too often absent from the consciousness of those who do not. Like attitudes and policies toward the poor and the incarcerated, the notion that Black women belong to America's colonized might be accepted theoretically, but its evil manifestations are largely hidden from view. Heritage and history, the legacy of slavocracy and lynching have all been erased, concealed, and rendered invisible. Yet cultural practices are shaped by dispositions of the habitus and implicit ideologies that are largely uninterrogated. In other words, there is a learned ignorance, a mode of practical knowledge not comprising knowledge of its own principles. Cultural practices are the result of hidden socializations that become so commonplace and routine that they are barely recognizable, because they are so insidiously embedded in the cultural milieu and in everyday thoughts and practices. The quotidian nature of oppression is of a piece with its accompanying denial and unwitting complicity. You all know Michelle Alexander's The New Jim Crow, Mass Incarceration in the Age of Colorblindness. And Michelle Alexander explains the complexity of denial. When it comes to mass incarceration of poor, brown, and Black bodies, prisons and the ghettos to which prisoners are released are literally hidden from sight, outside public view. Their invisibility serves an effortless denial. But the denial is also strenuously complicated by the fact that mass incarceration functions as a racial caste system, while it is officially colorblind. Race plays a major role in the way the system works, but if conceptions of the race problem conjure notions of violent acts of hatred and aggressive hostility, then something else quite different is at work. Michelle Alexander says the notion that racial caste systems are necessarily predicated on a desire to harm other racial groups and that racial hostility is the essence of racism is fundamentally misguided. At a systemic level, what has far more impact than social hostility is racial indifference. While racial hostility is unacceptable, not to mention illegal, racial indifference is not only legal, may even be mistaken for honorable manifestations of justice. Racial indifference cultivates the myth of post-racial existence. The race problem is behind us. We've moved beyond it. The racial indifference is to be commended, so the story goes. The attitude of racial indifference as an acceptable form of denial is fueled by the inclusion of whites in the racial caste system. This inclusion has the strategic benefit of protecting against the charge of racial hostility and sustains the myth of colorblindness. That poor whites are harmed in the process is merely a matter of collateral damage and helps to preserve the sanctity of the system. In short, the inclusion of some whites in the system, Michelle Alexander writes, is essential to preserving the image of a colorblind criminal justice system and maintaining our self-image as fair and unbiased people. Racism has an instrumental function. Discrimination against brown and black bodies is hostile and violent, but it is often violent on its way to another purpose. It is a means to an end. Violence happens to be a critical piece in the broader teleological trajectory, but the chief aim is power and wealth, not necessarily sadistic violence for the sake of hatred and hostility. The criminal justice system, Alexander writes, is no longer concerned primarily with the prevention and punishment of crime, but rather with the management and control of the dispossessed. The problem with racial indifference is not merely a lack of caring and compassion, but that indifference renders African Americans dispensable. It's hard to say that. Mass incarceration, a form of apartheid, is the new Jim Crow, except with far worse conditions. More than racial residential segregation, where black bodies are corralled in ghettos, mass incarceration locks black bodies in cages. Mass incarceration contributes to the symbolic production of race where slavery once defined blackness, now to be black is to be criminal. The shame and stigma of the black criminal body extends to family members and friends. The stigma of criminal is fundamentally a racial and social stigma, so that the term black criminal is nearly redundant. While it may not be acceptable to hate blacks, it is possible to hate a criminal without being labeled racist. Black male youth and black men are made black. They enter the process of becoming black. Mass incarceration is a race-making institution. But the significant point is that mass incarceration is formally race-neutral. Racial violence is rationalized and channeled through the state. Alexander writes, those trapped within the system are not merely disadvantaged in the sense that they are competing on an unequal playing field or face additional hurdles to political or economic success. Rather, the system itself is structured to lock them into a subordinate position. Most prisoners are caught in a cycle that from between ghetto to prison to ghetto again are caught in a closed circuit of perpetual marginality. The period of invisible punishment that happens when a prisoner is released and the forms of sanctions imposed is a means of legal discrimination. Black offenders are routinely labeled as felons and released into a permanent racial undercast. African Americans are thus dispensable because they are no longer relevant to the nation's economy. In the evolution from exploitation to subordination to marginalization, it is marginalization that poses the greatest risk of moving toward extermination. As Patricia Hill Collins points out, there is no profit from a dead slave. While exploitation presupposes some profit is still to be gained by black bodies, marginalization renders the black body superfluous and ultimately expendable. Alexander refers to the new normal, the new racial equilibrium that is established by legal forms of discrimination. These extraordinary circumstances are treated as basic facts of life. Okay, so what about revelation? I think we've done some revealing. Michelle Alexander has done a lot of work for us in helping us unveil this insidiousness of what remains hidden. But we need to make some theological claims here. And with revelation as a theological starting point, we not only refute idolatry, we reveal it. Acts of divine disclosure reveal God, and only God can reveal the human project of concealing God. Racism and sexism and their intersection are theologically relevant because they are expressions of idolatry. Foucault and Fanon and critical theorists can do the work of ideology critique and discourse analysis, but only theology can reveal the depths of the human endeavor to insert the human in the place of God. As theological problems, they require theological intervention. All the while, the theological intervention is itself a political practice, because theology is always already political. A womanist hermeneutic of revelation insists that we take the everyday experience of black women seriously in light of revelation and not in spite of it. In other words, it resists the tendency to generalize revelation in a way that it never touches the ground. Revelation is not theoretical. Revelation conjures abstract notions of a transcendent God. But the transcendence of God that presses the creator-creature distinction is what makes God's relation to us more intimate. The level of God's intimacy with us is only divinely possible. It's not a human possibility. The project of revealing oppression is theological, for it is theology's task to identify evils in their multiple forms and what God has to say about it. Theoretical analysis can do this work, but not to usurp the voice of black women's experience, but precisely the opposite, to give voice to the unrecognized evils. So the problem of revelation and experience is not a theoretical one that belongs only to the sphere of doctrines, but has practical consequences. The process of revealing oppressions belongs to the womanist agenda, both to lay bare the reality of these evils and idolatries and to reveal what God does to overcome them, or to God's response to these evils and the idolatrous. How does revelation help us from lapsing again into imperialistic adventures? Revelation, understood as God's self-disclosure, is meant to unveil God where God is otherwise unhidden. Such unveiling also discloses idolatry, apotheosis, imperialism, and the fantastic hegemonic imagination. Dolores Williams' Sisters in the Wilderness is famous for her soteriology, but what is also significant is her doctrine of providence. the presence of God, the God who makes a way when there is no way. Revelation is anchored in an historical event. As H. Richard Niebuhr puts it, we are in history as a fish is in water. But revelation cannot mean history if it also means God, for what we see in history is finiteness, caprice, arbitrariness, brutality. Ultimately, revelation is not about how we should find our way to God. Revelation is always about how God has sought and found the way to us. Revelation speaks to history, yet points to the event of God claiming partnership with us. Revelation is a revolutionary event that sets a question mark upon all human events. Indeed, Revelation establishes the discontinuity between the event of Christ and the events of history. The discontinuity disturbs our rationalistic sensibilities, but the mistake is in perceiving the paradox of revelation and history as entailing no relation between them. To say that the revelation of God is miracle is also to say that God's self-disclosure in history is an establishing of partnership with humanity. From a womanist perspective, discontinuity is precisely the point, for the revelatory event is a rupture of the status quo. The world as we know it is not sufficient unto itself. The exclusion and occlusion of Black women's bodies is the very reason why we must be receptive to something radically transcendent. Womanist theology helps us move away from the epistemological questions of cognitive assent to objects of knowledge and enlivens instead the relational and embodied element of faith, faith in a God who self-discloses in history through the Christ event. The Christ event is a kenosis, but not a self-emptying in the sense of self-abnegation, but a kenosis of the white supremacist capitalist patriarchy, to use bell hook's phrase, that dehumanizes the exploited, despised, poor women of color. Queering the flesh of Christ that Sean Copeland refers to is the subversion of how we normally conceive the anthropocentric and masculinist ways of being human. Turning the subject responds concretely to the dangerous memory of the body broken and poured out for us all. By attending to a new subject, Copeland writes, we commit ourselves to a praxis of solidarity for human liberation, and we make the mystical body of Christ publicly visible in our situation. Revelation is the mighty act of God's encounter with humanity in the Christ event. It is also the way in which these events continue to give meaning to our historical present. God's self-disclosure is not temporally confined. In Black women's religious experience, we find the marks of God's working in history. The Christian community must turn to the recognition of God's providential presence in all events of all times. For divine revelation is powerful enough to penetrate forces of evil and to have a word to speak. Thank you.